Good, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our wonderful webinar on wildfires. So we've got warnings for wildfires, and it's called Trailblazing for a Safer Future. So today we've got a really amazing lineup of guest speakers from all around the world, representing from Chile, Australia. So Ian's managed to get up very early to join us. We've got representation from Chile, from Europe, and from Greece as well. So we've got some good global representations today. So we've got a really exciting lineup. And so what I wanted to do was just really take this opportunity to introduce a little bit about the Warning Centre and today's session. So, I will just give a brief overview of the centre, and then we can move on from there in terms of focusing more on the actual event itself. So we are the UCL Warning Research Centre, and we are the only currently dedicated warning research centre globally to look at both natural and human-made hazards. And what we want to do is bring different experts and stakeholders from a wide range of disciplines together, from different geographies and different social and livelihood contexts, to come together to look at warnings. And this is for all sorts of hazards, threats and warnings, both human-made, natural, technological, cascading, multiple hazards, and so on. And the idea is that we want to build on existing literature, both from an academic perspective, but also in terms of practices, to explore what warnings mean, what can we share in terms of best practices, and help make them be more effective and be more connected to people. So we have around 25 core members from across UCL, and we have 27 global affiliates from all around the world who are experts in warnings. And our aim is really to bring together a centre of excellence around warnings, to create a community for researchers and practitioners from all around the world who are interested in warnings for all sorts of different hazards, to come together and find innovative new solutions to complex and real problems that we are facing. Of course, the pandemic and warnings around the pandemic is one of those key issues, and we just had recently a webinar focusing on health warnings as well. And we aim to sort of work on researching around warnings, building teaching expertise, providing policy advice and public engagements, and really help support the UN in terms of getting warnings on the agenda. So we've been really busy. We've done a number of reports. We've attended a number of conferences. We've had a number of webinars. So we've had a really good first year. We're part of the International Federation of Red Cross's Anticipation Hub. And on the right here, you can see we just recently, just a couple of weeks ago, released a report by the UK National Preparedness Commission, who asked us to write a report on enhancing warnings. And this report just gives a very big overview of what warnings are and what can we do to enhance and better warnings. So that's an example of what we're up to. So please do follow us on our social media. We'll have all sorts of events coming up, and webinars and publications. We really want this to be a space where the community, that's yourselves, that you are interested in various hazards and threats, to communicate, share information, and then we can use that to craft events or organise events and to create conversations about various events, various hazards. And of course, the hazard that we're focusing on today is that of wildfires. So you can get some pretty spectacular pictures of wildfires, as you can see from also Ian Mannix's backdrop here, and more from him later. So obviously, we know that wildfires are really important because we're seeing so many of them. Of course, in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge number of very large wildfire events. They affect a huge amount of people, as we know, and they are only increasing in terms of scale and impact due to climate change, due to the global warming that we're experiencing with these hotter and drier climates. And of course, these in essence also affect the climate by putting up more carbon dioxide. So it's a vicious cycle in terms of perpetuating the danger of wildfires. And of course, We've got many environmental impacts, which we often talk about, but also lots of health impacts, the physical health, but also the mental impacts as well. And so this is why wildfires are so important. They're just affecting so many people and really hitting communities right at their heart. Losing your home, your community space, and having that threat is obviously very daunting. And of course, that's why warning systems have been set up for wildfires. And there's the global early warning system for wildfires that you can see in this graphic here, that uses satellite imagery, that tries to provide a forecasting tool for where we might see hotspots or potential sites for wildfires. And you can see on the right here, we've got an image here that really is making the most of the latest technologies to create real-time alarm systems for wildfires based on satellite imagery, using radio, and being able to communicate with all sorts of communities and key fire support services through mobile phones and various other devices. And of course, there's been, like even recently, just earlier last year, December last year, there's been a new way of thinking about how warnings are being presented, including for bushfires in Australia, for example. So there's all sorts of considerations going on now, and how can we do warnings better? And essentially, that's what we're going to do today. So in this session today, we are going to bring together some amazing speakers who I'm going to introduce prior to their talk. We've got Dr. Thomas Undaraga, we've got Dr. Velisiki Catroni, and we've got Dr. Christine Eriksson and Ian Mannix joining us, and I will provide a brief intro before each one of those speaks. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a series of discussions around wildfires, what the key issues are in relation to warnings, what some of the experiences are, where do we need to go, and then we will have a discussion and a Q&A at the end. So please do feel free, everybody, to use the chat to make comments, to use the Q&A if you wish to add questions that we can ask our panel as well. And so we will be monitoring that and relaying and accumulating those questions for the end. So to begin with, we have Dr. Thomas Undaraga, who's going to be kicking off with his talk on the supertanker is a hero, the government of a villain, the politicization of Chile's 2017 mega fires in the media. And we're really glad that we're starting off with Thomas, because of Thomas's interest in wildfires is one of the reasons we're holding this event today. So thank you, Thomas, so much for joining us today. He is a project manager of the project Fondesit, which I'm sure is an acronym that stands for something very impressive, as academic projects do, and is looking at forest fires and new climate regimes. And so we're really delighted to have you here, Thomas. Thank you so much for inspiring this event, and we will pass over to you now to give your talk.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you, Claudia, and all the speakers who are here. What I'm going to present today, it's a work that I've been doing in the last couple of years with my colleagues, Mario Fernani, who I think is here also in the audience, and Professor Pedro Well. And this is research about how the fires has been studied and has been covered in the media, and in particular about what happened with the 2017 fires in Chile and how the media covered them. So let me tell you very briefly what happened with these fires. These were a really long, strong season of fires in 2017. Basically, during the months of January, February, and March, 600,000 hectares burned, basically 10 times the historical average. And these natural disasters and the warning systems that they triggered and the government response as a whole were really strongly politicized. So the media coverage of this fire crisis, interestingly, was edged by what was happening behind, what was the political struggle, political dispute about the government of Michelle Bachelet at the time. But interestingly, the main dispute in the media, it was focused on two main airplanes, both of them sent from abroad, the American supertanker and the Russian Ilyushin. So what we did for studying this is that we look at the whole coverage of the press during that time, and we tried to understand what were the political disputes that were behind and how that coverage affected the way in which the fires were understood and the warning systems can be understood. So these wildfires basically triggered multiple controversies, but we could aggregated them or identified 4 main topics that were really strong in the media. The first one was who was responsible. There were different type of entities that were given responsibility for it. Someone said that they were the electricity companies. Other ones thought that they were arson. Other one uncontrolled burns, or the very own forest firms that may have been claiming their insurances. So there were issues about climate change and about mismanagement of the fire. A lot of other news were strongly focused on the magnitude of the damage. Basically 14 people dead, 600 hectares burned, entire towns under the flames, and so on. A third topic that triggered the discussions about the fire were the government capacity to control the wildfires. And this was strongly one of the main topics that most of the media circulated around. But basically, all of these topics were concentrated and mixed by these disputes about the international planes to fight the fires, the supertanker and the Ilyushin. So we have 2 questions that we guide this discussion or this paper. And the first one is why the media coverage of the 2017 megafires in Chile hinged upon the airplanes controversies. And the second is what can we learn from the supertanker case for thinking about fire warning systems. So let me show you very briefly what we did methodologically speaking. We covered the 4 main newspapers in Chile, La Tercera, El Mercurio, La Segunda, and Las Últimas Noticias. We pick up all the news that had to do with fires from a period of 8 months, which is the fire season. And then we make a cut of the ones that were explicitly linked with these mega fire events. And those were 286 news. And what we did with each of them is that we analyzed them, identifying the framing, the coding, and the narrative of the news. And what can we find there? We found basically these 4 controversies that I was telling you before about who was responsible for stopping the fires, how was the government crisis management capacity, what was the human drama around, and what happened with the aircraft. So just let me briefly introduce the story itself. So what was the controversy about this airplane called supertanker? Basically, in the 2nd or 3rd week of January 2017, when the fires were already out of hands, the enterprise global supertanker offered the services of this Boeing 747 that has been fighting fires in other places. However, the Bachelet government was initially reluctant to hire this airplane, basically based on some NASA reports that suggested that this aircraft was unsuitable for fighting fires in the mountain areas, as was the case of the Chilean fires. However, the supertanker promoters and the political opposition of Bachelet government, they began a really strong political communication campaign aiming to exploit politically the crisis. So the political dispute focused mainly on how was the government's capacity to manage this disaster, and especially how prepared or unprepared they were, how slow was the reaction, and how much they were improvising for coping and dealing with the fires. And the wildfires basically was used by the opposition to reframe some previously existing political disputes, which were about the Bachelet economic reforms, basically the taxing reform, the labor reform, and the educational reform. So with this in our back, what we found in the coverage is that the government completely lost the framing contest to interpret the crisis. Basically, the codes that were and the settings that were put to analyze the way that the government was doing in management this crisis were completely defined by the opposition and by the very own promoters of the supertanker. So political oppositions and the very own journalists were arguing in the press that the government was doing really badly, that they were arriving late, and that they were basically improvising. Just let me read this final quote here that I think is a good summary. The doubts about and the delay in accepting the offer of Luciana Avilés, which was one of the promoters, to bring the supertankers is one of the two main errors that led the government to lose the communication battle. This is at the end of January of this month, when the whole country is under fire, and what people really want is to have some sort of help. And this airplane was was thought to have the capacity to help turning off the fires. What is our main argument that we present in this paper is that the media coverage of the wildfires transformed what was a natural social phenomenon, as are wildfires, into a political drama. And the supertanker in particular, this airplane, played the so-called condensation roll symbol. Basically, it was signified as the hero in the combat of the fires, and at the same time, the Chilean government was symbolized as the villain. If we look at what is the narrative of the whole process of covering the wildfires in the press, this is the main narrative. The supertanker was the external hero that promised to control the fires that had completely overwhelmed the local capabilities and overcome a government that was portrayed as inefficient and late to respond. So when we analyze specifically what were the codes in which all these different news were setting these different battles, we can identify clearly two kind of different type of codings. Or the battles basically were between who is the hero and who is the villain, who has agency and who is more passive. And so the plane related to the government, which was the Russian Ilyushin, was considered less efficient compared to the supertanker that was more linked to the private sector and to the opposition of the government. The opposition prepare was also very established. The idea of the private airplanes from the private enterprise that were more efficient than the public one. And this airplane was from the United States, the supertanker, versus the Ilyushin that was from Russia, and that was also very exploited, and was linked to candidate Piñera, who was the leader of the opposition at the time, and the other one was linked with President Bachelet, who was in the government. And from one side, the main actors were the finances, the pilots, and the promoters of the supertanker, whereas on the other ones, the spokespersons were the government and the very own CONAF, or the Chilean institutions. So what can we learn from this case? First, I would say, to try to understand these main two questions that drives our research is why the press coverage of the 2017 wildfires focus on the supertanker airplane. And there are several factors that is important to understand here. First, I would say that it's the human drama of natural disasters themselves that they attract public attention, and they are greater opportunities for demanding accountability about political authorities. So disasters in themselves are great stages for assessing the way that authorities perform and demanding accountability about their performance. So there's a human drama element that is important here to stress and recognize. A second antecedent that it's very interesting to understand this story is that there is a history of previous politicization of disasters in Chile, in particular what happened with the tsunami in 2010, that there's lots of literature about that, how Bachelet government was a few last days in government and they responded very late, and that produced a huge catastrophe with more than 300 people dying. And also the deep mine rescue of these 33 miners that were trapped 720 meters under in a mine. And they were used politically very smartly by Piñera's government then to gain legitimacy. And then a third element that is important to recognize is the dramatic elements about the very own case. These are images of airplanes dropping water, people clapping and cheering for the pass of an airplane, towns and forests and the flames, and it's really a very spectacular thing. So the supertanker in this context was portrayed as a hero, bringing hope to a population that has lost it, and ratifying this idea that Bachelet's government was sort of incompetent. And this is my last slide, which was I close, is what can we learn from the supertanker case for thinking warnings for wildfires in the future? A first issue to consider is that wildfires are multivalent disasters, and therefore they are susceptible for having various types of framings. They can be about expertise, about human suffering, about warning and response, about environments, about politics. A second important learning that we can have is, and this is very much connected with STS, and Karina, and I think that lots of researchers here have done a lot about this, but is that artifacts can have charisma and can have agency in political narratives about disasters. The third conclusion is that media plays a central role in warning systems and in the politicization of natural disasters. They stage and co-script writers of the drama, elevating certain framings and narratives and suppressing others. And finally, and with this I close, is that the press coverage of the airplanes and the political disputes may also divert attention to key issues in warning and the understandings of fires that are not properly covered by the media. In this case, at least in the 2017 fires in Chile, the issues about the role of the forestry industry and the very own role and place of climate change itself were not fully addressed because we were focused on what was going on with these airplanes. So that's my presentation. Any questions and comments? We're very happy to discuss them later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Thomas. That was really fascinating. We will be coming back with some questions in our Q&A. So as Thomas just said, if you do have any questions or any things that you wish to discuss, pop them in the chat and we will make note and come back to those later. So thank you very much, Thomas. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Christine Eriksson. So I hope Christine is ready in the standby position, ever ready with our crises that we have. So Christine Eriksson is a senior researcher with the Risk and Resilience team at the Center of Security Studies at ETH Zurich. She has widely published research on wildfire preparedness, community cohesion, and social ecological systems. And today we are really grateful that she will be presenting wildfire warnings for a fiery future in an emergency about the long-term social impacts. So over to you, Christine.
Thank you very much. I'll start out by just checking that you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Good. So thank you for the invitation to contribute to this panel. When I initially read the invitation, I wondered how to frame warnings, because there are many different types of warnings depending on the temporal and spatial scales, the target audience, the purpose of the message that the warnings are trying to convey. And the three most immediate types that came to my mind in the context of my research are warnings about a fiery future, warnings that meet the needs of people at risk during a wildfire, and warnings about the long-term impacts of wildfire. Now, I am clearly not able to talk about all of these types of warnings in detail in 15 minutes, but I will attempt to give an overview of some of the key issues to consider. And on my slides, I have included details about publications I have written on these topics if anyone would like to know more. So a quick warning also to the audience that I will interchangeably refer to wildfires, bushfires, and forest fires purely out of habit. They all refer to the same natural fire phenomenon. So to start, I'll focus on the details that warnings need to convey in order to expand public understandings of our fiery future. And to do so, I'm going to use two concepts that are central to wildland firefighting: anchor points and fire lines. When faced with a wildfire, wildland firefighters set up an anchor point, and the anchor point is an advantageous location in a forest, scrub, or grassland from which to start constructing a fire line. And a fire line is a control line that is scraped or dug into the ground to create a burn boundary. Fighting a wildfire is known colloquially amongst firefighters as being on the fire line, and both notions hold deep symbolic meaning for firefighters as they play a crucial role in controlling the spread of the wildfire while upholding the safety of firefighters. Notions of anchor points and fire lines also act as poignant metaphors in acknowledging our growing inability to manage fires in the Anthropocene. So human activities has altered the parameters of Earth systems, making fire lines less effective in controlling the known and emerging consequences of climate change, including wildfires. The impacts of human transformation of the planetary atmosphere mean that even without our direct intervention, life on Earth is feeling the impacts of human activities, such as the use of fossil fuels through pollution and extreme weather events. In the Anthropocene, environmental management is akin to fighting fires of such escalating intensity that neither an anchor point can be found nor a fire line established. Our transformation of Earth systems necessitates new understandings of the relationship between humans and fire. While fire is essential to human existence, the relationship between humans and fires has always been profoundly unequal. And climate change exacerbates this inequality due to its cascading effects, with one change resulting in or interacting with another change like a series of falling dominoes. For example, a warmer and drier climate results in more high fire danger days and longer fire seasons in more places than just the regions traditionally considered to be fire prone. These conditions exponentially increase the risk of uncontrollable wildfires, and the unequal social impacts of wildfires add more inequality to this equation. Now, climate change is often espoused in public debates as being the main culprit of our fiery climate crisis, but social factors are equally at play. The climate crisis is in part a result of the intimate relationship between land use, fire exclusion, tree dieback, and a hotter and drier climate, which act as a positive feedback loop. Forests are carbon sinks. However, the suppression of wildfire by land managers in many parts of the world since the mid-19th century and the stifling of the natural alliance between plants and fire has resulted in a buildup of fuel that is contributing to the catastrophic megafires that we are experiencing today. Moreover, rural abandonment has resulted in both a loss of local knowledge and less fuel management as part of traditional farming practices. Fire exclusion has also resulted in many forests being more prone to diseases than that naturally occurring fire regimes and colder winters once kept in check. The tree dieback, as well as megafires, contribute directly to climate change by upsetting the forest carbon dynamics. And so the positive feedback loop continues. So in Trailblazing a Safer Future, warnings for wildfires need to engage the broader public about the fiery future that we are already living in, the multiple costs, and how to coexist with wildfire. What will it take to re-establish anchor points and fire lines that we can actually rely on today? Scientific knowledge clearly shows that reducing greenhouse gas emissions could effectively stem climate change. However, warnings need to emphasize that even if the reduction targets of the Paris Agreement are met, which will directly mitigate the frequency and intensity of future wildfires, it is too late already to return to the more manageable and less smoky landscapes of the early 20th century. The costs range from the need for more post-fire restoration efforts, greater losses of assets, livelihoods, and lives, to the upscaling and training of specialized wildland firefighter crew and international cooperation. We also know how to coexist with wildfire it is not the knowledge that is lacking, but rather the will to make it happen. Warnings could do more to communicate this knowledge. For example, we know that how we manage the land and where we live matters. Local and indigenous environmental knowledge is crucial to sustainable land stewardship. Knowing the difference between good and bad fire regimes is important. Homes built in fire-prone landscapes is another source of fuel unless construction follows fire-resilient building codes. We know all of this. It's time to act. In our efforts to relearn and reappreciate our relationship to fire, it is increasingly clear that in the Anthropocene, we are all on the fire line in need of an anchor point. So what does this mean in an emergency? One of the findings from my research show that framing and timing of warnings have a gendered angle. Disasters are gendered social experiences, and understanding this is important for the effectiveness of wildfire warnings. My research in Australia and the US highlight the increased vulnerability of both women and men because of the activities they tend to perform before, during, and after bushfires. Many women deprioritize bushfire preparedness in the context of other pressing issues in everyday life, while societal pressures see men attempt to perform protective roles when the fire threatens that many have neither the knowledge nor the ability to fulfill safely. Poignant statistics drive this message home. So when gender dimensions of risk engagement are contextualized in everyday gender roles and traditions and compared with bushfire fatality trends in Australia during the last century, published literature show a frightening correlation between women and men's activities of time of death historically and intended plan of actions during bushfires, and in this case, when the study was done in 2013. In short, most women tend to evacuate. Women predominantly die while attempting to shelter or evacuate. Most men intend to stay and defend, and men mostly die outdoors attempting to defend assets. A study we did of the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria highlight that bushfire risk information engagement in the education initiatives had not managed to curb this trajectory of bushfire fatalities at the time. I do not have time to go into the detail of the study I have outlined here on the slide. I want to highlight, though, that official bushfire safety policy was modified after Black Saturday, due largely to the recommendations of the 2009 Victoria Bushfires Royal Commission. And key amongst these changes was the revision of fire danger ratings to include a category beyond extreme. And this led to the development of the National Framework for Scaled Advice and Warnings to the Community and the introduction of the catastrophic rating. There has, since 2009, been a marked shift in the advice provided by fire authorities to emphasize the risks to life associated with staying to defend and the relative safety of leaving early. Our study suggested a number of opportunities for enhancing community bushfire safety. For example, women were found to have reflected more critically on their level of planning and preparedness than men, suggesting opportunities to develop bushfire awareness and education programs designed specifically to engage and meet the needs of women. Similarly, women were more receptive to advice from relatives, friends, neighbours, and emergency services, suggesting opportunities for tailoring and communicating information, advice, and warnings to women. It also showed that there's a clear kind of time difference between when warnings are most likely to be picked up by men and women, respectively. It was also very clear that people should be encouraged to plan and discuss the intended responses of all household members, including contingency plans, to avoid last-minute disagreements and decisions, which in the case of Black Saturday resulted in a number of fatalities. Another example of wildfire warnings meeting, or rather not meeting, the needs of people at risk is the issue of residents travelling into fire zones despite official warnings not to. There is no consistent advice on how to adequately prepare for, cope with the known issue of residents who are not at home when a bushfire starts, leaving a safe area and entering the fire zone to rescue or defend property, pets, and loved ones. This problem is exacerbated with the high levels of residents who commute on a daily basis to the city and therefore attempt to return with limited and congested routes, which are simultaneously relied on by emergency vehicles and evacuating residents traveling at speed. Fast-moving bushfires also decreases the likelihood of anyone having sufficient time to return home or find a structure suitable for shelter en route. Yet, as my work and other research has repeatedly shown, a significant proportion of residents attempt to return home upon learning of a bushfire threatening their home and or family. Our study of the 2013 Blue Mountain bushfires in New South Wales highlighted 5 particular themes, which are all discussed in detail in the article mentioned on this slide. What I want to emphasize here is that to simply ban residents from returning home during a bushfire with roadblocks or mandatory evacuation orders is a simplistic and short-sighted solution to an overtly complex and ongoing issue. Solutions rather are needed that can successfully be worked across agencies and residents. For example, packing a box of vital belongings, such as documents, photos, medication, and clothes, and taking it to work on catastrophic or extreme fire danger days could be a standard part of commuting through bushfire-prone landscapes. Employers could play an active role in promoting bushfire safety education specific to the needs of commuting employees, creating contingency plans for children, the elderly, people with disabilities, pets. All of these can involve neighbours, schools, employers, family, friends, to ensure that alternatives to travelling towards or through a fire front have been considered and agreed upon before the threat eventuates. Now, I want to end by briefly highlighting some of the long-term social impacts of wildfires, which will become more common and take a bigger toll on society as wildfires increase in frequency, intensity, and scale. Warnings for wildfires need to alert society at large, but also local communities in particular, to the fact that for many people, recovery is ongoing for many years after a wildfire. The official recovery period of disaster psychologists often point to a period between 7 and 9 years, but some of my work, for example, in California, showed that the continuing impact more than 20 years after the 1991 Oakland Hills firestorm in the San Francisco Bay Area was quite significant. Wildfires will also increasingly challenge the ability of first responders and recovery workers to continue to cope and care with the repeated impact of catastrophes that increasingly will be unmanageable. There's also the heightened risk of vicarious trauma and PTSD among disaster researchers and journalists. The loss of home, livelihoods, friends, family, and community to a wildfire also makes it difficult for many people to weigh up the risks and benefits of deciding to rebuild or relocate, and these decisions are often pressured on them at a time when they can't think clearly and of course have long-term consequences. Additionally, social support networks are ruptured and continually challenged post-disaster. Our longitudinal study of recovery 4 years after the 2013 Blue Mountains bushfire showed that changed construction standards and bushfire attack level ratings impacted the ability of people to repair and rebuild. And for many, this also concretely resulted in residents being underinsured. So these are all social dimensions of disasters that need to be considered when trailblazing a safer future with the help of warnings about wildfires. And I'll end just by quickly encouraging anyone who has trouble accessing some of the publications I've mentioned here to get in touch if they would like to read them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was a really fascinating presentation as well. Gosh, really insightful comments there, and lots of thoughts bubbling around in my mind. I'm sure there is for everyone else too. So thank you very much for that. Right, so we'll move on to our third speaker, and then we'll take a quick comfort break before coming back for our final speaker in discussion. So we'll come back to Dr. Vasiliki Kotroni, who is the Research Director of the Institute of Environmental Research and Sustainable Development from the 3 institutes of the National Observatory of Athens, and she will be presenting early warning systems for forest fire and operational implementation for Greece.
Okay, so that's great. Here I am going to present something more technical about an early warning system for forest fires as we have implemented it in Greece in our unit, the Meneteo unit at the National Observatory of Athens. So, okay, the motivation has been already mentioned before from the previous speakers. We have a lot of extreme wildfires events around the world during the past decades, and many of them have resulted not only on casualties for civilians and fire respondents, but also produced damages to livestock, infrastructure, and ecosystem. And there is a large number of legendary, let's say, wildfires, like the 2018 campfire in California, which resulted in 85 fatalities. The 2009 wildfires Victoria in 173 fatalities, and the 2020 large fire in Australia, which produced more than 1 billion losses of animal life. And if we come to the Mediterranean climate, which is very much favoring both the ignition and the spread of wildfires, I should mention the case of Portugal with 150 fatalities that have been produced by the severe wildfires in 2003, 5, and 17. And also, if I go to my country, okay, we had the large wildfires in 2007 with 84 fatalities, 2018 with 102 fatalities, and also I should mention the recent fire season of 2021, where we had more than 500% increase of the burnt area compared to recent climatology. And indeed, this fire season of 2021 came just after a very large, severe heat wave in Greece. So the wildfires showed some extreme behavior with erratic fire spread, massive spotting, and the occurrence of pyroconvection. And if we look here in this graph, the blue line shows the average number of hectares in total, the accumulation of the hectares that are burned during a fire season, the average from the years 2008 up to 2020. And we see that at the end of the fire season, we have something like, on average, 20,000 hectares burned, while the red line is the recent fire season. The fire started very early in the season, in early May. This is the red line, and the accumulated burned areas reached something more than 130,000 hectares, which is although an increase of more than 500%. And these extreme events are becoming the new normal in many countries of the world, around the world, since they are associated with increasing frequency, size, intensity, and severity of the fires. So this shows there is an urgent need for better monitoring and development of early warning systems against extreme wildfires, or to inform or increase the preparedness against wildfires. And this is very important because it is needed in order to alert the population for the emerging risks, but also to assist the operational agencies and the fire services in their planning and in their allocation of resources. So this is was the objective also of our group. A key purpose of our group in the frame of consecutive projects was to develop, validate, and operationally apply a set of services that employ state-of-the-art observation and modeling techniques and deliver an early warning system for forest fires in Greece, with the ultimate goal to assist the authorities in better preventing and addressing and finally mitigating the adverse impacts of wildfires. So our system encompasses 4 main pillars, and I'm going to talk for each one of them separately in the following slides. So the first pillar is the monitoring of the fire weather conditions. This is very important to monitor which is the fire weather conditions, because weather is a very crucial factor for the fire spread. So we use the surface weather stations that we operate in our unit here in this image. Are you seeing my how I move in the slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So here, this is Greece, and those color points show the location of our network, where we monitor at 10 minutes interval the weather conditions, and so the fire weather conditions also. And in the system that we developed, we also demonstrate some indices that are very important for people who are dealing with forest fires, like the accumulated rainfall of the day, the monthly accumulation, the yearly accumulation, because drought is a very important factor that plays a role in the fire spread. Also, based on a temperature and relative humidity that we're receiving of our stations, we estimate the fuel moisture content of the dead fuel, the dead fine fuels, because this is a real proxy and a very good estimate of the landscape flammability. We are producing some maps like this one, where with the coral scale, we show from very low to extreme the estimated flammability of the dead fuels. And this is very important because when we reach high values, it means that the landscape is so flammable, and then fires can ignite more easily and can spread even more easily. The second pillar of our system is the forecasting of the danger, of the wildfire danger, and this is performed through the calculation of fire weather indices. There is a large number of indices that are used across the world. One of those indices, very well known, is the Canadian one. We have the modified Nester of Fosberg-Haynes. We calculate those indices at a very high spatial resolution, 2 by 2 kilometers for the next 3 days, based on temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and precipitation. Those are the weather variables that are very much related with the fire weather danger. And we present them, as you can see here, with the color scale again, from low to very high. And we know for each day, today, tomorrow, and the day after, which will be the fire weather conditions. The third pillar of our system has to do with the remote sensing of the wildfire activity. The wildfire activity, for this, we are using geostationary satellite data from Meteosat which we receive at our group every 15 minutes at 5x5 kilometer resolution. And we apply algorithms for the detection of the fire spots. Here we use land surface analysis satellite application facility algorithms, which have been updated with the collaboration of the University of Athens. And we combine satellite and geospatial data to indicate areas where eventually a fire has ignited. Here you can see an example. This is the southern part of Greece, Peloponnese, and here is an island, and that's how the system represents an active fire. We have the longitude, the latitude, and we know the time. And if you have multiple fires, you have multiple small fires over the map. Of course, here I should mention that in order for a fire to be detected by the satellite, it should have acquired a certain scale. The very small fires or the fires at the very initial point cannot be detected. Of course, we use also in our system satellite data and mainly here Sentinel-2 data in order to map the burned areas. Here in this map, you can see the estimated burned area that have been burned during August 2021, this year, in the very, very large fires that burned a very large island in Greece, Evia Island. You can see that more than 50,000 hectares have been burned during almost a week. And this is the 1/3 of the forest area of the island. Okay, it has been destroyed. We're coming to the final fourth pillar of our early warning system. This is the rapid response system for fire spread forecasting. I should mention that in general, the operational agencies around the world, they tend to rely on some type of empirical or semi-empirical models which are able to provide a quite reliable wildfire spread prediction. However, such models neglect the fire-atmosphere interaction and feedbacks, which are very important for simulating the wildfire spread. So in our group, we have worked on this issue and we have developed IRIS. IRIS is an operational system, a coupled fire atmosphere modeling system adapted for the pyric environment of Greece, which in order to calculate the rate of spread of the fire uses the properties of the burning fuels, of meteorological and terrain slope data. And there is a two-way interaction between the fire and the atmosphere through heat fluxes. This means that the fire model makes the atmosphere feel what is happening with the fire and changes the wind, the temperature, and so on. This is very important in order to produce, let's say, the most reliable forecast of how a fire will spread. And the system provides ultra high resolution forecasts of wind, rate of spread, fire intensity, and fire perimeter. And we think, or at least based on our knowledge, this is the only forecast system that operationally is implemented in Europe and one of the few worldwide. This system, how it works, it's a fully automated system and it requires no human intervention at all. It has been developed for the Hellenic Fire Corps to be activated, and it is activated on demand, exclusively controlled by the officers of the Hellenic Fire Corps through a password-protected web application. What does it mean? That the officers at the fire service can just click on a map and give the latitude and the longitude, the exact location and the time of the ignition of a fire. And then there is, once they do this, then the wildfire is registered in our web application, and there is a daemon that brings this information to our computing center at the National Observatory of Athens, and then IRIS is triggered. What does it mean? What does it mean? That from the triggering, from the activation of IRIS, in 15 or 20 minutes, we are able to send back to the Hellenic Fire Corps, which will be the spread of the fire in the following 6 hours. And within an hour, we send them information about the expected fire spread for the next 12 hours. And I have here a video on the information we're sending. Here's a fire that has been ignited in Evia Island. And here you see a small fire. This is the ignition point. This is what the fire corps officers are providing to us. And then from our side, IRIS is activated, and the red line and the red coverage shows in the spread of the fire. So they have information in order to know how they will dispose their forces in order to combat the fire. The information we're sending them also, except of the video, is also like this graph. This is the red lines give the spread of the fire every half an hour for the coming period. And also we give them information about the maximum rate of spread. And also we give them with a scaling from 1 to 7 an estimate of how difficult it will be for this specific fire to be addressed, to be managed. From 1 to a completely manageable fire to number 7, which represents the totally uncontrollable fires. Okay, so who are we targeting with such an early warning system? Of course, the regional public authorities, which could take advantage of the fire danger forecast by setting up and scheduling more effective strategies. For example, they can go to the forest and work about reducing the accumulation of burning fuel, of dead biomass. We are targeting civil protection agencies and fire services, which, based on the real-time monitoring of the fire activity and the modeling of the spread that we can send them, they can increase their capacity to combat the wildfire and inform and protect the population. This system also targets the private sector stakeholders and, of course, the general public, which could use the provided information as means of their own protection against the wildfire threat. Of course, it has been mentioned also from the previous speakers and also by the introduction by Karina, that the climate change also is it's a factor that will intensify the wildfires risk in the future. So there is an increased need for the affected countries to develop prevention and mitigation strategies and useful tools to help combat, to be better prepared and to combat the danger and mitigate the effects. So this is why we think that early warning systems for forest fires are very not only useful but necessary. This was my presentation, and I would like to give replies to any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And indeed, I thought you started with a very pertinent quote: extreme events is the new normal. And I think, yeah, we're seeing that perhaps more in wildfires and some other weather-related hazards more than anywhere else. So absolutely. So thank you very much indeed. So we go on to our final speaker in our session today on wildfire warnings, which is Ian Mannix. So Ian is a director of Forewarned and a former manager of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation Emergency Broadcasting. In 2019, he self-published the Principles of Effective Warnings and has written 2 books that explore the individual behaviours of people who survived floods and bushfires in Australia. Ian was awarded the Australian Public Service Medal for his work and is a fellow of the Emergency Media and Public Affairs Australia. And as an affiliate of the Centre, we're really delighted that you can be with us today, Ian. So thanks very much for getting up so early and making it. So he will be presenting the Principles of Effective Warning. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Karina. It's good to be here. It's 2:43 a.m. where I am. I didn't make a cup of tea because that would have woken up everybody in my house. But it's great to be here learning from Christine, Thomas and Vasiliki. We've got much to learn and much to share, and these global forums enable us to do that. I do come to this, to wildfires from a different perspective. I'm a journalist, a person who reports, a person who observes, and a person who's got a responsibility for holding those in positions of authority to account. I think I've just shared my screen with you, just confirm that that's working.
Yep, it's working.
In 1997, I switched over from being in the newsroom to being a manager of a radio station. It was my first attempt at doing that. Very soon after I arrived, there was a bushfire in the Dandenong Ranges near Melbourne. I rang up the Country Fire Authority and said, would you give us a warning for the people who are confronting that fire? And they said to us, we don't do warnings. And I said, well, I want one because I'm going to hold you to account. Words to that effect. They said, we've never printed one. We've got no idea how to make one. But just at that moment, a woman named Susan McKenzie was literally walking past the door of the manager I was speaking to, and she said, I'd like to try. Susan and I wrote Australia's first bushfire warning. We put it to air in January 1997, and within 15 minutes, our audience on ABC Radio had told us 2 things: that they wanted to hear it again and that the fire had changed. So we realised that we were going to have to update the warning every 15 minutes. The Country Fire Authority was not equipped to do that, and neither was ABC Radio. But we did it. We got a great deal of positive feedback, and that was where the first Australian bushfire warnings were broadcast, where we literally worked together with the Country Fire Authority in a very collaborative exercise to try to give people information they could use to survive the fires. Unfortunately, those Dandenong fires, they were typical of Australian fires, and unfortunately, 3 people died. They were huddled in a house, in the basement of a house, and they died of smoke inhalation. I would like to be able to say that they died in each other's arms. The truth is they died widely apart and in extraordinary pain. At that stage, I decided that ABC Radio would be able to do better in the future, and our focus would be on giving people information they could use to survive and respond to bushfires. It was a big project. By 2008, I had pretty much worked out how we would do this. I had good relations with the Country Fire Authority in Victoria. I told them in 2008 that if there was a catastrophic level bushfire, the system that they had put in place would fail. And unfortunately, the beginning of 2009, it failed completely and 173 people died. After that, the Royal Commission in Australia advised the rest of the emergency agencies to look into what the ABC was doing and make a proper warning system. So that's my background. I'm very proud of the role that myself and our emergency broadcasters have played. We know we've saved lives. We know that we have collaborated with emergency agencies and the Weather Bureau. Between the lot of us, we've enhanced each other's reputation and built a lot of respect. And still, people die. Consequently, I continue to observe what goes on, and I have written this book, The Principles of Effective Warnings. It's based around the principle of human response to warnings, the psychological response. When a person is flooded with cortisone because they're under stress, they're not going to be able to take in information in the usual way. We need to be able to write warnings for those people in a way that enables them to respond and survive it can be done, so long as we're listening to psychologists. Having done that and created a chapter of a book, I then thought to myself, well, who's going to read this book, The Principles of Effective Warnings? The answer quickly became apparent to me because I happened at the time to be working in Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and the South Pacific developing countries where they don't have any warning system. So I decided I would write them a platform, a book on which they could create a warning system. It starts with ethics, and of course, it has the principles of effective warnings. This enables people to work through the process of establishing a warning system. We'll come to that in a moment. What gives me the authority as a journalist to do these types of things is my role as a journalist. I wrote this book, interviewed people from 70 different communities around Australia about how they survived fires. It doesn't contain a single death. These are the stories about people's preparation and what enabled them both as human beings and as communities to survive wildfires. Not long after, I did the same thing with floods. In that process, I came to understand how humans responded, how they behaved, and what they needed from emergency agencies. So let's just jump now to the 2019-20 bushfires in Australia, which were horrendous by any global standards. The total number of the total square kilometerage that burnt was 186,000 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, Greece is 131,000 square kilometers. Austria is 83,000 square kilometers. England is 138,000 square kilometers. Imagine burning your entire country. The map that's on the slide here is in red, the area of the state of New South Wales, which burnt. But in the 2019 fires, they started in Queensland, which is the state to the north. Those fires started in rainforests, and we're going to have to find a new word for them. They started in rainforest in August. They burnt from the north of New South Wales all the way down to the south of New South Wales. And by January, they were burning in Victoria, in the rainforest country, in the Blue Mountains country, places where fires had never been burnt at this level in our recorded history. Unfortunately, 32 people died, 5,000 houses were burnt, or 5,900 houses, and 4 billion invertebrates were killed. I don't know how they make a decision about 4 billion invertebrates, but you can see the scale of those fires was dramatic. At the end of it, as you would expect, there was a review. The Black Summer Review, conducted by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC in Australia, was a comprehensive document on how the community responded to the fires. And the findings, in fact, were quite good. Despite the fact that there were 34 deaths, the research found that they would, if the warning systems hadn't been in operation, there would have been very many more. They compared this fire in 2019 to the Black Saturday fires of 2009, when 173 people died. I don't think that's fair. There was no warning system in Black Saturday. To give you another example of where I'm critical of the type of research that was brought out by the Rural Fire Service, they said that very large numbers of people, 70% of all people, did receive an official warning. But unfortunately, within that, they also said that many people got their official warnings from television. There are no official warnings on television. Warnings need to be urgent. They need to be timely. Television was carrying none of those. Warnings also have to have a whole heap of detail. What the people were confusing was news and current affairs information with official warnings. So I see in reports like this, the Black Summer Report, some of the pitfalls that come when we don't really know what we're trying to do with our warning system. Is it just a case of the total number of people who heard there might be a fire and were able to respond? Or is it that those people are going to respond effectively? They're going to save lives. They're going to perhaps reduce economic damage. Without a principle behind the warning system, we can't really understand and know exactly what we're going to do. When the fires continued to burn south into Victoria at a town called Mallacoota, there were about 30,000 holidaymakers. They'd come up for the Christmas holidays. Even though those fires that were burning in New South Wales had dominated the media for 3 months, 30,000 people still went to Malakuta for their summer holidays. They got trapped there, and as you can see from this image, they had to be taken off the beach by our naval boats. It was a complete disaster, but many people thought that it was a highly effective response because nobody died, but they came very close to dying. Why would 30,000 people go on holidays in a fire-prone area? I've got no idea. I wouldn't do it, but I'm familiar with the environment in those areas, the one road in, one road out, the access to services, the failure of telecommunications. All of these are problems that occur every year in bushfire zones in Australia, and still people went to their favourite holiday destination. When the evacuation occurred, the roads were closed. They had to come out by boat. It was ridiculous, ultimately. I then spoke and did some workshops with the Country Fire Authority in Victoria. I did 2 workshops, and I asked the fire managers, how confident are you that people respond in the way that you want to your bushfire warnings? And you can see there that some were somewhat confident, some were not very confident, and none were very confident. I would argue that the warning system, as good as it is in Australia, can be a whole lot better. You can see here that the total number of deaths of coronavirus is rising, no longer exponentially, but it is rising. I would argue that the warning system around coronavirus can be a whole lot better. In fact, Eric Feigl-Ding, who's an American public health scientist who's currently a senior fellow and widely read around the world for his statements and his concern about COVID, said, and wrote on a little flag outside the White House when they were angry about the total number of deaths in America. He said, this epidemiologist is sorry he has failed you for failing to warn loud enough. Just another example that there is warning systems in place, but they don't seem to be working. Here's another example where the UCL has done some research and described the COVID alert level system as close to meaningless. And thank you very much for Karina and the UCL for reinforcing the things that we know globally now. The warning systems aren't working. But today we're talking about fires. Australia has, as Christine already described, quite a good warning system. Still people are dying. The warning system is owned by the Australian Disaster Resilience Knowledge Hub. It's in books that are owned by them, described in a lot of detail. The role of warnings in public information, the 3 levels of warnings, consistent set of hazard icons, and consistent hazard warning frameworks. It's a pretty robust system. It's been reviewed a number of times, and it's also been subject to some research. The Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience does back their warnings systems with a framework, including their principles. If you put the principles in place before you create your warning system, you will have a better foundation and a better warning system. I'm not going to go through what the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience says, but there are 10 principles. It's great to see that their first principle is to save lives. That's the meaning, that's the reason for having a warning. If your warning is not saving lives, is it really a warning? It empowers the public to participate in the process. The warnings have to be trusted, authoritative, and verifiable. They have to be scaled based on risk. They have to be timely. They have to convey impact. For many professionals and researchers in the warnings industry, these things are standard now, but they're never written up or rarely written up to underpin or provide a foundation for a warning system. And I think if we know what we're trying to achieve when a warning system is put in place, it's going to be a better warning system. Prior to the AIDR putting out their warning principles, I wrote the book that I started to talk about for the people in developing countries in Southeast Asia. I came up with 10 principles of warnings, not because I wanted 10, that's just how many I came up with. They're different to the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience. One area which in particular I want people to focus on is warnings being based around the ability of a human being whose bodies are flooded with cortisone to be able to understand the warning when they're issued. The Red Cross and Save the Children puts out community early warning systems guiding principles. They've got 13 of them. I know about this because Lamin Saidi, who's one of the people on Karina's list, she comes from the Gambia. She has used this book. She sent it to me this week. She has used this book, or their organisation has used this book to prepare their early warning systems in the Gambia. They've got 13 guiding principles, and you can have a look at those in that book at any given time. However, they're not calling them principles, they're calling them guiding principles. I don't think that's strong enough. Over here, we've got the United Nations DRR. The closest I could find the UN coming to principles was this document from UNDRR. You can see that they've got 4 principles, really. To make an effective end-to-end and people-centered early warning system, you would have disaster risk knowledge, you would have detection, monitoring and analysis, you would have dissemination and communication, and you would have preparedness. They're not very simple or straightforward themes. The UN tends to write its documents for well-educated or even master's level educated disaster risk analysis and people in those areas who have responsibility. When I go to developing countries, I can't find anybody who's got that high level of understanding about the risk analysis and disaster preparation who could probably well understand this. But if they start with the principles, then everybody can understand them. Why have principles? It provides a solid foundation for community safety. It tells us to think what we're doing and explain it to the community. And it gives communities an opportunity to create their own system. If you're living in a developing country, or you're living in a small town in Greece, or a little town in the Blue Mountains in Australia, and there is no warning received, you've always got an environmental warning to go on. There'll always be smoke, there'll always be heat, there's usually a drought. You can create your own warning system. If you've got the principles that are based around these things, you'll be able to cope. Very often now in modern world, we're relying on technological solutions to give people warnings. We're disempowering them if we do that. What we need to do is say to every individual, both at a disaster response and recovery expert agency, but also in every community in America, every church and faith-based community, we need to say to them, look, the phone system might fail, the roads might not be passable, the power is likely to go off. Let's avoid technological solutions by going back to the principles of what it means to have an effective warning system. And it also gives us an opportunity as researchers, as people holding governments to account, to benchmark certain goals for review. And I think that's really one of the most important elements of principle-based warning system. So, but most places don't have principles. They don't even have ethics underpinning their framework for emergency warnings. What I would hope is an organisation like UCL's Early Warning Centre might be able to look at the value of principles underlying warning systems, total warning systems, people-based warning systems, and try to create those principles that enable us all to put these things together in a better way, a more comprehensive way, in a way that the entire community can respond and recover. If we had done that when the Australian bushfires had occurred in 2019 and 2020, we could go back to our principles and say, how did we go? Principle number 1 of the Australian bushfire principles from the AIDR is life-saving. We lost 34 people. We lost about 200 injured. Did we meet that principle, or do we need to review the warning system? If all of those 34, of the 34 people, a number were American pilots who'd brought over a heavy tanker to respond to our terrible situation. Unfortunately, they crashed the tanker, but the rest were people at home, either defending their properties or driving away from their properties. Did they know of the impact, the people who were defending or driving away? Did they know of the impact? If they did, the warning system failed them. If they didn't, the warning system failed them. Was there a call to action? Mostly in Australian bushfires now, at some stage, a warning will be issued to say, it's too late to leave, you must stay in a well-fortified, fire-proof house. That's presuming that these people are going to be trapped in fires. I think the principles of fires of saving lives shouldn't give anybody an opportunity to be trapped in a fire. If you have a look at my principles of an effective warnings, number 4, a warning should be understood immediately. Somewhere along the line, we've failed people in that regard, because if they understood it, they wouldn't have died. Warnings should be integrated into a person's life. This is through the areas of school, of churches, of sporting clubs, of community development. This enables people whose minds are being flooded with cortisone at the time when they're under enormous stress to know what's going to happen, to have practiced it, a bit like the earthquake shakeouts that we hear a bit about in America and Italy, I think, New Zealand. We need to integrate warning systems into people's lives so that when they are confronted by a warning, they know what's going to happen. They might not then be quite so ready to drive into a tourist resort that's surrounded by fire. Warnings must build the capacity for the public to respond effectively, even if no warning is issued. Well, people will see smoke. They will, in the case of flooding rain, see the rain. They'll know something's happening in their community. If they don't get a warning, they should not be helpless. Again, I'd raise this as an option, as a principle of emergency warnings, and a great goal for all of us. So ultimately, I wrote my book, The Principles of Effective Warnings, and I'm hoping people will consider whether or not underlying their warning system with principles is a good idea. And I would give a great deal of credit to Rob Gordon. He said to me when I first met him that the media causes more problems than it fixes in most disasters, and that got my attention. And that's where he was talking about the media who rush in and then abandon communities that have yet to be fully recovered. The media gets in the way of emergency agencies. The media undermines the authority of emergency agencies. And of course, the media wasn't at that stage putting out warnings that would enable people who are under stress or who are ordinarily part of our vulnerable communities, children, people with disabilities. They were never going to get warnings in a way that was going to make their life different. So I think these elements are really important, and I would encourage people to understand the psychology of bushfire warnings and how they're received, and then decide whether they're going to put an ethical and principled framework around their warnings system. You can obviously talk to me on Gmail. You can have a look at my website. And as I said somewhere else there, I'm Sed Vitae on Twitter. And I'm always looking for people to give me examples of where these things can work and where they don't work, and where we can do better and where we should do better. Thank you for that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So what I want to, what a great set of 4 talks. We've had 4 different perspectives here in terms of looking at the having a journalist's perspective and the real sort of, there's a demand, we need to have a supply here for the demand, and how do we actually go around that. We've had the political perspectives and all the issues driving that in terms of the Chile, which Thomas talked about. We've looked at risk and resilience that Christine really focused on, so that interaction between the science and society and how that works, the need for being more inclusive as well in terms of our warnings and the gender issues around that, which is extremely important, not just for wildfires. And then of course we've had Vasiliki, who's really given us some real practical, good examples of demonstrating how to develop a warning system and how effective that can be in Greece, and also the challenges that we continue to face with seeing these large-scale events. So we've had some really great insights. We've had some great comments made about, our warnings really working. Ian's just talked about, can we actually move this to action? And that's actually one of the things that we talked about in the Enhancing Warnings report, is like, how can we actually make action from these warnings? Otherwise, kind of, what is the point of them? And so basically what we're going to do now is, I can see Henry's got his hand up, but what we're going to do is we're just going to have a little discussion between the speakers, and then we'll come back to a Q&A, bringing some of the questions in from the chat and also any other questions that come into play. So I shall hand over to Thomas now.
Thank you, Karina, and to all the speakers. Very, very interesting talks and lots of insights to continue discussing. So we have 4 main general questions that I want to share with the whole panel, and then to try to address specifically the questions were put by the audiences and the people that are participating. So let me read these 4 main questions and see who can pick them or how can we discuss them. So the first one that we were thinking was, what key universal lessons have been learned around wildfire warnings to date, both good and bad? What can we say about key universal lessons about wildfires? The second question is, what is the most important thing needed to make wildfire warnings more effective for the future? And I think that many of the things that were said in all of these presentations can be helped to address this question. The third question was, what are the challenges of dealing with wildfires as part of multiple and cascading hazards? And the fourth and final general question is, how can the public and authorities better prepare and warn for wildfires in 2022? So Christine, Vasiliki, Ian, whoever who wants to pick the first one, or the second, or the third, or the fourth, please jump in.
This is a massive undertaking that you've got there, Thomas. Those 4 questions could take us not only all afternoon, but for the rest of the week, and we still wouldn't have any understanding of what we're trying to do. Key lessons learned around warnings. I tried to point out that the warning system for COVID has failed. 6 million people have died. I pointed out that any deaths in natural disasters, I know that's a phrase you guys don't like me to use, but any deaths in geographic disasters probably are deaths too many. Any destruction of economic loss is too much. I wonder whether or not what we're learning from these extreme hazards is that we're not coming at the right angle. We're not trying to prevent all deaths. I say that knowing that the Weather Bureau in India is trying to prevent all deaths. The Weather Bureau in Australia, about 3 months ago, did a presentation I was at. They're going to go for a 0 deaths approach. And when you have a look at the total number of people who are in evacuations in the US, those big fires, 60, 70,000 people, somebody over there is clearly saying, okay, let's try to prevent deaths. And I think what we're learning now is that maybe that's a key lesson from all of these disasters.
Thank you, Ian. Vasiliki, Christine, would you like to pick any of this?
I might jump in.
Okay.
Just following on one of the points that Ian said about not like the unpopularity of the term natural disasters, because I think that actually speaks to the whole warning situation. And so just to explain to the broader audience who might not be in on that discussion, is that natural disasters gives the impression that a natural hazard, which really is a natural hazard, is fully to blame for the disaster. So it kind of renders people vulnerable and powerless, where actually we know that most disasters is a product of socially constructed risk. And so in terms of where we build cities, do we build them in floodplains? Do we build them on the top of ridges surrounded by forests so they really will burn if there's a big fire comes through? All these things are really important, and that's one of the things I think our warning system generally can do much better at, is trying to, well, A, get the language right, they're not natural disasters, but B, is to explain to people that the choices they make, the choices building developers make, the choices local councils make when they agree to certain road expansions or neighborhood expansions, really makes us vulnerable in certain ways. And so, for example, the big floodings we had in Germany this past summer would refer to these floods as biblical events as if they were never going to happen again. Well, we know that these are much more likely to happen more regularly in the future. And some of the areas that were really hardest impacted were low-lying areas where there probably never should have been built homes in the first place. So getting these warnings out will help not just in the heat of the moment, but also more broadly in how we actually create the society and the environment and how we shape the ways that we live with a known increase in natural hazards.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Vasiliki?
I am, I'm very happy of what I have listened from the previous speakers who are working more on the societal part of all this risk of wildfires. I'm from the more technical part. From my side, I would say that what I see that it is missing is a more robust collaboration between the scientists from one side and the public domain, the fire services and whoever, to know which are the products, what the science can bring in, and on the other side, what do they need to respond to this risk, the mitigation and coping capacity and so on. Because sometimes I think that we don't discuss between scientists from one side and the first respondents or the public on the other side, or the civil protection side. I think that at least from the example of Greece, I can say that a more close collaboration is needed, which is not in place, at least in my country. On the other hand, I should say, Christine talked about being able to get the language right and explain to people that they have made choices, and they which have put them in a more vulnerable situation. This is very much linked also to education. And I think that we should go to schools, to young people, and explain how those choices that they will make as future adults will make them more vulnerable. How they can, which are the vulnerabilities? How difficult it is when you choose to live, or if you live in a wild and urban interface near a forest. How more vulnerable you are, how you must change your life, and also if you live in a vulnerable area, or if you are more exposed to the danger, how you can deal with it. You must know the risks, and you must know the hazards. You must know how vulnerable you are, and then be more prepared for the risk, for the related risk. And I think if I should remind you of the tsunami case many years ago, and the only people who were saved, there are some people from Sweden, I think, some Sweden tourists, where their children have been had a course on tsunamis, and they were able to see the way the sea has retreated. And then they knew from their lessons or courses at school that these waves will come back to the coast. And they took their parents away from the coast, and they were saved. And they said that we were saved because our children had the course about the tsunamis. So I'm saying this to, and I conclude with that, that we should be better educated about the risks. Mm-hmm. And we're not, at least in Greece, we're not. And this is something we need to make it better.
I would like to add an experience about the Chilean learnings from the last mega fires of 2017, which was something interesting that what generated afterwards, being the massive disasters and the risk and the really bad reaction or bad preparedness from the government, but also from the towns and from the forest companies that were the main the main forests that were ignited, is that people and communities and the areas and the risk needed to work together to face this. And that meant a big shift in mentality. So the enterprises that, to an extent, the forestry industry had kind of the back towards the community, they realized that the only way to assure their own states was to work with the communities. So that meant a really locally work of knowing who are the local leaders, how to inform them, and how to put them in the same in the same line to face together the next fires, how to prevent them, how to cut properly and trim the trees in certain areas, how to avoid putting houses, especially too close to certain areas of production. So what I found interesting is that there is a lot of talk about kind of public understanding of science and public communication of warning systems. Yet there is another part of the work which is very locally community connected. And I think that is as important as the other one, or to put it in a different way, we need both actions to be done at the same time. So that, I think, it could be taken as an interesting universal lesson. So let me go to the questions from the public to try to address them if we can. So one of the present people was asking, in better preparing for 6th-generation wildfires and extreme weather situations, which are potential mistakes to avoid in the process of reforestation of burned areas? I don't know if Christine, Vasiliki, or Ian would like to say something about that.
Christine?
I can jump in. I could see that you were on something on the tip of your tongue. Now, clearly, I am not a fire ecologist, so anything I say here will be taken with in perspective. But what is very clear is that some of the backlash that you get after big catastrophic fires about, well, we shouldn't have trees, we should cut down all the trees, that is not the solution when we're also dealing with climate change. It comes back to that acknowledgement of, if you choose to live in a fire-prone area, you need to know the risks and you need to know how to handle them, sort of things. And if that means leaving early and living with the real possibility of losing your house, so be it. What we really need is to reforest or restore these natural environments back to what are endemic to an area. So one of the problems, for example, in California is that over 100 years ago, a lot of eucalyptus trees were planted for economic reasons. They were needed, the timber was needed. Well, the timber turned out to be rubbish and the trees just kept growing. Not only are they sopping up all the groundwater, but they're also incredibly flammable. And so what we would need to do in reforest areas that burn in California is to not plant eucalyptus trees again. So these are some of the lessons that we know are coming out that not necessarily are being taken up, because there's usually always an economic and a political incentive that drives restoration and rebuilding projects, rather than kind of sound knowledge about how to build back better.
Interesting that you mentioned eucalypts. We've exported them to Greece and to Portugal, and they've got 12% volatile substances that they burn really quickly, and it's not one of Australia's most best exports. I'm sorry for all of those countries to be burning. There's a piece of research done by the CSIRO in Australia a few years ago which showed that 80% of all deaths by wildfire occurred within 800 metres of a forest. If you don't live within 800 metres of a forest in Australia, you've got a very good chance of surviving even the most catastrophic bushfire. So once people come to understand that level of risk, and it's a good piece of research, then they're probably not going to live in the middle of the forest. Or if they are, they're going to leave when the fire ban rating suggests that it might be a catastrophic fire day even before there's any sort of ignition. So people need to understand what the risk is that they're entering into when they live in a fire-prone area, and then wear the risk. Build a house that's like a fortress, if you like. It'll cost you a fortune, may even save your life, but it won't be won't be much fun. You'll never get the soot out of it afterwards. So maybe don't live within 800 meters of a typical burning forest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that there is a question that is directly to Vasiliki in particular, which is how accurate is the location timing of this iris system? And how often or when do you usually update predictions of the system that you showed working in Greece?
Okay, what we have done is that we have validated the rate of spread and the area that the fire has spread during a certain time with previous fires. It seems that the system is working quite good. I should say very good. Of course, in the fire spread, we don't take into account any efforts that are made from the fire respondents to stop the fire. So we should say that we give a fire spread prediction of the worst case, as if nobody could stop it. Okay, so it is, as I said, a quite validated system. And if it is, the question also was how often we update it. Yes. Well, the system starts, is triggered once the fire service or the officers give the exact position of the fire ignition. So we start it once and we do not update it. And we give some information, information on how the fire will be spread within 1, 2, 3, 6 hours, 24 hours. In order to update the prediction, we should be able to start the model not from one ignition point, but from a perimeter, the new perimeter that the fire will acquire in some hours. And this is the next step that we are working on, to be able to start the fire spread from a perimeter of a fire. This is somehow more difficult, but this is the next update that we're foreseeing for our system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Vasiliki, I have a question that follows on from that. I've been a critic of the Australian bushfire systems for some years because they have given fire spread maps to their own staff and been very successful in making sure that their own staff are never put at risk, but they don't give those fire forecasts or fire spread maps out to the public. In fact, for the first time in 2019, the Rural Fire Service of New South Wales did issue their fire forecast maps, and they were very well received here. They would issue them in the morning, they could be appearing on TV, and they could be in the newspapers once a day. None of their maps had a direction for wind, and I notice in your map, Vasiliki, that there wasn't a wind direction on that either, but I think that's really helpful. Do you give your fire forecast maps to the public and update them as often as every 30 minutes, like you mentioned on that on one of your slides?
Look, through the collaboration with the fire service, we have accepted, because this was their will, not to give the fire spread open to the public while a fire is propagating, because they wanted to be sure that they will deal with evacuation and whatever, and the decisions they should make. So from our side, from the early warning system, everything is open to the public as for the forest fire risk and danger, because some meteorological conditions are highly risky. Let's say this is the forecast that we are issuing, and this is updated twice a day for the next few days. So this includes also information about the dryness, the flammability, the winds, etc., and the fire weather danger. We give information about the remote location. The location of the fires that we have seen by the satellites, but we don't give them information of the fire spread for an active fire. We do it afterwards when everything has stopped, in order to see that this is a validated procedure. But I must admit the following. We had, during the past 3 years, we had a very close collaboration with the Hellenic Fire Service. And we had collaborated with us, and we used this system for all the active fires for the 2020 season. We they used the system for 31 major fires. But then their structure has changed, and this year, which was a very, very active year for Greece, they didn't use the system anymore because 3 of the people who were responsible for that have moved and some new have arrived. So that is why I'm saying that the collaboration should be between the respondents, between the scientists, should be more close, because we are there, you know that. Also, we are there to help, and our science gets value gets more value if it's usable for the people. I mean, otherwise, what are we doing?
I would argue that the single most important piece of information for people in a bushfire is a fire forecast spread map like you have, and your authorities are not providing it. That's not a good warning.
Yeah. But this goes along with education, because you cannot give people the fire spread if they are not educated how to deal with this information.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, we can do it all.
Yeah, of course. We should do it all. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have to start closing, and we have like 7 other questions. I don't know which one to pick. No, I just would like to ask particularly Ian and Christine, perhaps, this issue about the possibility of politicization or repoliticization that fires, and particularly the fire reconstruction, then opens as a way of preparing warnings for the future. I don't know if in your own experiences of Australia and all the cases that you have studied, Christine, like what do you think that could have been the lessons from the possibilities that politicization or repolitizations of these disasters open for future warnings?
While Christine's thinking through that, and we can see the thinking on your face, Christine, the most important element of the fires in Australia were that they started burning in August and they finished burning in January, and gave everybody an opportunity to prepare. Some people were still unprepared, but it also meant that politicians could be situated in places where there were going to be lots of excitement, drawing up all of the energy that was needed from the recovery. I think that was a disaster waiting to happen. And there are community leaders amongst us who want to take advantage of these types of things for their own electoral purposes. There's also media that wants to take advantage of these things for their own commercial purposes. There's no doubt about that. But we can learn from all of those things. The ABC approach to emergency broadcasting is to build the reputation of emergency agencies, and not during a fire to undermine any emergency agency, because the community has to come to trust them. So that's written into the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's policy. It also means we can put politicians to one side and say, no, we're not going to talk to you just for the moment. There's a fire happening. I think one of the big disasters with COVID was that it was politicized very early. And then the experts, the scientists, the people with knowledge like Vasiliki, Christine, you, Thomas, the people with knowledge were sidelined for far too long. And the community eventually responded poorly to that, because they could see that these life and death situations were being politicized.
Mm-hmm.
I'll chip in very quickly. There's so many things I could say, but just I'll build on what Ian was just saying and point to the fact that the disaster is often not the biggest disaster comes after the disaster because of the politics, the social issues, the social rupture that happens, all these kind of layers in society that gets exposed because of the wildfire. So the wildfire comes, it usually has an end point, and then you have to recover, and that takes much, much longer. And so one of the things that the politicization of the whole thing does is that is glossed over and forgotten. So we know from different media studies that you have very particular time windows when you can get a message across. And in terms of the actual disaster, well, it's while the disaster is happening, but even if the disaster keeps happening, the focus will start to shift, even though the communities are still being majorly impacted. But in the aftermath, in the disaster recovery, we know that 3 to 6 months later, most of the news stories will have moved on to other issues, and communities are left to cope with this on their own, and they often feel abandoned, not just by other communities, but also by their politicians and the broader kind of social networks in society. So that's probably the one thing I would point out to here.
Thank you.
I'm interested in the question about animal health and biosecurity. If you've got 2 minutes to let me rabbit on about that, I'd appreciate it.
Please go ahead.
A couple of years ago in Australia during a cyclone, 600,000 cattle were trapped on cattle properties in outback Queensland, and they died either drowning or crushed up against a fence. In 2019-20, during these dreadful so-called Black Summer bushfires, tens of thousands of koalas, marsupials, animals were killed. The best response that we've got to prevent poor preparation and planning and to improve the way we respond is to make those animals much more of an emotional connection with the human beings around us. So when we saw a woman pull off her top to protect one koala, when we saw firemen using the last drops of water to feed koalas, when we saw baby calves snuggled up against their mums who were dying on the fences, it was the emotional connection that made our community look at what we were doing, how we valued animals, and it made a possibility for change. In fact, the Weather Bureau now in outback Queensland, Western Australia, Northern Territory is issuing warnings based on that cyclone to enable people to open their gates to let those cattle out and perhaps save not only an economic resource, but also that animal resource. And we often forget how important animals are just to the well-being of human beings. So sorry to jump in, but I saw that question there and I thought, let's not ignore the plight of animals anymore.
I'll just very quickly add as well, thank you, Gareth, for that question. It's a really good one. In Northern California, in Butte County, where the campfires happened, they had been working for many years to create a better system for warning to pet and livestock owners and how to get their animals out before the fire hit. And it was mainly driven by vets who cared, because it was very traumatic for them to go in and put all the injured animals down or go in and bury all the dead animals. And it kind of has not received a lot of attention. There's work happening in Australia as well on this, but a good case study to look on is the Northern California Vets program. It's really great.
Mm-hmm. I would like to apologize for the other questions that we have not enough time to fully embrace them, but they certainly are inspiring our continuous conversation about this topic. So I bring back to Karina the lead now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Thomas. And thank you for everyone's participation today. So I'm sorry we've overrun by a few minutes. It was such a great discussion. I think we could have kept going for at least another half an hour, due to all the great questions and comments. So thank you very much. And it was a really great interaction between the four of you. That was a pleasure to watch. So thank you for your presentations and for your contributions today. Thank you to also our participant audience who have been really good at asking questions introducing yourselves as well. That's been really, really great. We will be putting the video of this onto our YouTube channel, which you can see the link for in the chat. And please do follow our social media. We'll be having a number of other webinars coming up over and events coming up over the next few months. We've got some goodies lined up, so please do keep in touch with us. And we really hope that this is the start of a focused conversation around warnings with wildfires. So please do get in touch with us. Let's, if there's a demand, we can definitely do more events, more webinars, have more discussions, roundtable events. We're here to try and create the discussion that's much needed and facilitate the requirements in terms of us trying to make warnings better and save more lives and make our environment a safer one. So please do contact us so that we can action that and create the space to do that. So thank you to everyone. Thanks for all your kind words and comments. Stay safe, and we'll see you the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To everybody.
Thank you.